Welcome, everyone. We will give people just a few minutes to join before we get started. Welcome, everyone. We will give people a few minutes to join. But before we begin, we thought it would be nice for all of you to see who else has joined our conversation. So please fill out the quick poll that will pop up onto your screen to see who else is in our virtual room. Okay, well, good afternoon or morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Yoon Choi, and I'm the CEO of CollegeSpring and your moderator for today. For those of you who are learning about CollegeSpring for the first time, we're the hosts of this panel, and we are a national nonprofit that provides SAT preparation specifically for students of color, low-income students, and first-generation college students. We believe deeply that every student should have equal opportunity to prepare. To that end, our focus is bringing SAT preparation inside the system, in the schools where all students are. Our curriculum is taught by classroom teachers during the school day, ensuring that every student has access to what's often considered an extra for our student population, but is status quo in more affluent communities. Now, The pros and cons of the SAT and ACT have long been hotly debated. And oftentimes the conversation boils down to you're either for them or you're against them. These tests are fair or they're unfair. And these days, with test optional policies in the headlines, the other binary is these tests matter or they don't matter anymore. They count, they won't count. So today, our goal is to expand the conversation and discuss other ways of thinking about the test and these policies. But before we get into that discussion, I want to pose a broader set of questions. Questions about options. What do you hear when you learn that something is optional? For example, an optional meeting or an optional assignment. These days in particular, who wants an extra optional meeting? So given the choice, most would probably opt out. But what if I then told you it was an optional meeting to meet the CEO or an optional assignment related to an overall grade in a class? Most would probably reconsider. See, you don't have to attend the meeting, but there may be some advantages to meeting the CEO. You don't have to do that extra assignment, but it's possible it could positively impact your grade. It's not explicit that your opting in will count one way or the other, but it is an option and it exists for a reason. And you may have a mentor or a parent encourage you to do that extra optional thing. I'll help you, I'll drive you, they say. Or you might have someone say, listen, you have a lot of other things going on, or I have a lot of things going on. There's no guarantee this is going to help you, so let's focus on some other things. Who do you have to be? What resources do you have to have? What position do you have to be in to exert that choice, to choose or not to choose to do what's optional? And historically, if we look at our education system and outcomes, which kids have been led to and offered the bare minimum and why? And who is focused on competitive advantage and why? So as we talk about equity and this test as a requirement versus an option, I'd like for you to think about these questions when we ask, does this test matter for our students? Can they lead to equity? It's, of course, a much bigger question than just about the test itself. So I'm excited to explore these questions with our panelists and with all of you here today. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, I have the pleasure of introducing Ann Wicks. Ann develops and oversees the policy, the research, and engagement work as the Ann Kimball Johnson Director of the Bush Institute's Education Reform Initiative. Before joining the Bush Institute, Ann served for 5 years as Associate Dean for External Relations at the University of Southern California's Rossier School of Education. And over her career, she has held management and resource development roles at organizations including Teach for America, the Lucile Packard Foundation for Children's Health, and Stanford University. Welcome, Ann.
Hi, everybody.
Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Chantel George. Chantel is a native of Lafayette, Louisiana. She is currently the founder and lead consultant of Chantel George Consulting, and she brings more than 10 years of college access and success experience in the areas of higher education, K-12 college and career readiness, and nonprofit leadership. She began her career coaching and advising students through their journey to and through college in Houston, Texas. And to date, Chantel has built and maintained more than 30 strategic partnerships between K-12 districts, institutes of higher education, and nonprofits, all to improve and close the gaps that exist for underserved students transitioning and persisting from high school to post-secondary education. So welcome and thank you, Chantel.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
And finally, I have the pleasure of introducing Jamie Jacobs. Jamie has worked in the education and nonprofit field for more than 10 years And as Deputy Director of the Michigan College Access Network, Jamie provides strategic support for MCAN and all its departments and programs. Jamie also serves as the lead of the High School Innovation Strategy Department, which includes all the grant making, school-based campaigns, professional development, school counselor leadership development, and partnership development between K through 12 and higher education. Welcome, Jamie, as well.
Thanks, Ewan. So glad to be here.
Great. So I am so excited to speak to you all today. And I wanted to start off with an icebreaker or get to know you question so that our audience can know a little bit more about your backgrounds, but then also your experience with the test itself, since that is the topic of the conversation today. So I'd like to ask each of you about your own personal experience with either the SAT or the ACT. Did you prepare for the test? How did you feel about it? How did it impact you? So Ann, let's start with you.
Okay, so we're gonna have to go in the way back machine because I'm decidedly Gen X. So this has been some time. But I grew up in Minnesota, which has traditionally been more of an ACT state, particularly at that time. I did not prepare for the test and took it. I went to what I would call like regular public high school, nothing fancy, no magnet, comprehensive, just standard Midwestern high school. So we had a couple of AP classes, but I didn't really know about AP classes, honestly, until I got to college and some people I was in school with had taken them. And I had to drive like an hour to a private school to take the SAT. Most kids from my high school did not take them. We did not test prep. And so I did no prep and just sort of showed up and took the test.
Great. How about you, Chantel?
Sure. So I grew up in Louisiana, as you mentioned. So I took we are an ACT state, still an ACT state. And at the time, which is so funny now that I've moved back home right before the pandemic, I was a TOPS curriculum student. So if you guys are familiar with Louisiana, TOPS is the state aid available to students if they're going to opt to stay in state for college. That's what I remember of like middle school to high school. It's like TOPS, do whatever you need for TOPS. And at the time, it was a 20 ACT to receive the scholarship, and that was in 2006, and it is still a 20 ACT, which I find very interesting. Nevertheless, I took the ACT for the first time actually as a sophomore in high school. Thinking back on it, I'm trying to remember like why I did that. I just remember my mom saying, well, maybe we should start early, because she knew that the community and the individuals and students who looked like me normally were scoring less than the 20 and having trouble getting the top scholarship. And so she was really the motivator around, hey, let's start early. As Ann, I didn't prep at all either. I just showed up with my calculator and did decently. I actually ended up taking the ACT 5 times in high school to try to continue to get my score up, because I was trying to strive for the additional scholarship money that was available for those who had a higher ACT score. I also was applying to a lot of out-of-state colleges as well. I had no idea about the inequities of the test until I became an adult, which is why I'm excited to have this conversation today. Nevertheless, I also took the SAT. I opted to take the SAT as a student in Louisiana as well, because it was just rule of thumb that students of color were doing better on the SAT. And I actually did better on the SAT. And so was able to kind of submit both scores to both in-state and out-of-state schools. So that is my story of ACT. Took it a ton of times and started in 10th grade.
Wow, you took these tests a lot of times, both tests.
Yes.
How about you, Jamie?
So maybe as a stark contrast, Chantel, this was a nice little journey. I grew up in rural Michigan. I'm a Michigander through and through. Love Michigan. I see some Michigan folks on the call, so super glad to have you here. Michigander proud. I don't know what happened, but I remember my parents saying something came in the mail. You're going to go to this. We're going to drive you to this school and you're going to take this test. And I was in 7th grade, and it was like, I still don't know exactly what it was, but I was like selected as a kid who maybe had some potential, right? This is all I knew. And I was going to take a test, and I had no idea what the test was. I knew nothing. Like I didn't know anything. I just showed up. I couldn't even tell you where I was at. Some school somewhere away from home, early in the morning. And I did, I think, fairly well, right? Like for a 7th grader, I don't know, right? And I remember my parents keeping the score, not sharing it with me. I had no idea what was going on. Nothing came of said thing. I don't know what it was about, but then my school, so we're in Michigan at the time, we were in ACT state, and several schools were piloting what was soon to become part of a new requirement for every student to take the assessment. And so I also, and went to like just really traditional sort of neighborhood high school, and our class was required to take it. And I so much didn't want to and so much didn't prepare that I like made a point to advocate for not having to take it again, because I was reminding folks at that time, like, oh, I took this in 7th grade. Now I'm smarter and I understand I took this. And I was like, I think that score is going to get me into the colleges I want to go to. And so like, why would I take this again? So I actually like advocated. It may have been the only time I advocated for myself and was like, I don't want to take a test again. So no prep, only took it one time. And I was very young, and oddly enough was able to use that score for admission, which is also interesting, into state colleges, and had zero idea that you could get better scores by prepping, or that you could get better scores and get money, which was also not in my head and no one told me. So a unique, strange pathway.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from all three of you is very common. We hear, this from our students. I hear varying level of sort of preparation history, varying degrees of knowledge about the importance of the test. And also, I don't want to take this test. Why should I take this test? What kid wants to take a test, right? And so these are all sort of the common things that we're hearing all the time. Now, the subject of this test in inequity as part of this conversation is really at the core of what I'd like for all of us to discuss today. So I think, the SAT and ACT are often criticized for perpetuating inequity in higher education, because scores correlate so closely with race and income. And Chantel, you repeatedly said, your mother understanding the outcomes for students of color really wanted to make sure you were prepared for this. So, I would like to open this question actually to each of you to ask, why do you think these tests in particular have become such a lightning rod for conversations related to equity or inequity? And let's start with you. I know you broadly think about and have done research on assessments in general. I know you know a lot about these standardized tests in particular. So why the link between these tests and inequity?
Well, I think people get understandably riled up. I'll use that term, or a lot of attention is brought here because it's one of the starkest examples, right, of the gaps that we see, the systemic gaps, right? There's no ignoring it. It brings it to the forefront, whether you're talking about SAT, ACT, your state summative assessments, and I'm always sort of puzzled because it's a little bit like getting very angry at the thermometer when your child has a fever, right? Like the test is the moment, and what you're actually understanding has nothing to do with the child, right? Like we believe at the Bush Institute, all children have the ability to learn and succeed. We don't think talent and ability is segmented by race or socioeconomic status. And so when you get the test results, that's really about what's happened to the child up until that point. What has impacted or accelerated or decelerated their ability to progress. And that's where the really interesting, hard conversation is. The test is literally the spotlight, as the way we think about it and what we understand now about the sophistication behind how these tests are constructed. So that's my quick take on it.
Yeah. How about you, Chantel?
Yeah, I think for those of us that have been in education, right, test optional, standardized tests, we've been studying this and looking at this for a while, but now with the pandemic, it shined a light on test optional, test free, test blind, and what shined a light on education in general, but specifically around colleges making the decision to go test optional. And so I think it brought another conversation to the forefront in regards to equity. And from my experience as a student, as a child, now as an educator, is the access piece, right? That is missing when we talk about equity. So it gets folks riled up. You have your extremes, right? And I think many of us probably on this panel have our own ideas around how we feel about the test. But to Ann's point, the data doesn't lie around the gaps. I mean, the gaps have been there for years and they have not closed at all. It is still a large gap between students of color and white and Asian colleagues, in particular around ACT and SAT. And as we talk about, who has access to prep, whose school is offering prep, race and income, right? A lot of that goes into the conversation. And so I think because there has not been a shift in these scores, many states are still testing below their state averages. Many students are still testing below their state averages and don't have access to even get into the room when we talk about post-secondary. And so that becomes a larger conversation of, tracking students, which students have access to what institutions do they have access to. So test optional is nothing new, is what I've been sharing with folks. I'm like, I've worked with small private liberal arts colleges who are test optional, right? And so them being test optional, they've always been test optional. So that's not anything new. Now we're seeing some of the state colleges that are going test optionals in whole states like California that are opting to that as well. And my response has been, we will see where the numbers lie. We will see in the next 5 or 6 years with the class of 2020 and 2021, specifically those that have been admitted to state colleges who did shift to test optional. I'm curious, and I also wear the full PhD hat as well. So I'm curious to see how those numbers are going to look, because I'm someone that's a believer in GPA being the predictor. And so for me, it's a matter of time for us to see. But I think the pandemic has also created a little bit more conversation around the inequity piece.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jamie, what are you sort of seeing and learning from the schools that you are in such close contact with in Michigan and throughout the state?
Yeah, perhaps. So MCAN's work is largely focused on systems change. So I definitely approach this in that same way around the systems. And, I would argue that the issues are systemic and systematic. And maybe this is cynical, but I think it's really easy for us to focus on an instrument, to focus on a test and ignore the larger systemic inequities, classism, racism, all these conversations we don't actually want to have that we know exist in our education system. They exist everywhere, right? They have always exist. And it's just much easier, quite frankly, to blame students for failing or not measuring up, or to blame the test for being a bad instrument and just sort of failing at measuring students, whatever, aptitude, ability to learn, skill set, what have you, because then we can just not actually talk about the system and the disaster of the system, because I think we've gotten a lot of folks to the place, we globally, right? Not we, Jamie, but we've gotten folks to the place of understanding that the system isn't working. But I think best case scenario, folks say we need to fix a broken system. But I would argue, I think MCAN would argue, what we're seeing in Michigan, I think we see this play out nationally, is we need to dismantle a rigged system. And that's actually what the test shows us, right? The test, I would say, is like doing an autopsy on what's the result, who's the winners and who's the losers out of a rigged system. And then we say, shame on the test for showing us and shedding light on our system that's broken, but we don't actually want to address the system because that's really hard, challenging, difficult, race and class-based work. And that stuff makes us uncomfortable. So I think that's what we see play out.
Yeah, so it's interesting because for proponents of sort of moving to a test optional or test blind world and getting rid of the SAT or ACT, that is often talked about as part of systemic change, right? Like that's really a way to change the system, or even more broadly speaking, test optional policies that will change sort of the system of higher ed and admissions. But really the question is, will that lead to systemic change? So I want to talk a little bit about the test optional policies and their impact. So since test seatings were canceled during the pandemic, many colleges are moving to test optional or test blind admission systems, and say they plan to stay that way after COVID-19 as well. What are your thoughts on these decisions? Will they have positive or negative implications for educational equity? Jamie, let's start with you, just to reverse the order a little bit.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I am a woman of science. I have a degree in engineering. I originally was an engineer, and I don't want to hedge. Early data from institutions that have been test optional is not particularly promising to say that this will have dramatic impact. This is different. Chantel talked about that. This is different. So it's a waiting game to know for sure. But it feels to me like it isn't a systems change. It is, right? It at its core, it's a policy change. It is a change in the system. But I guess like I was trying to think of an anecdote, and it feels like I'm in a 10-foot ditch and you gave me a 4-foot ladder and said, why can't you climb out of the ditch? And I was like, thanks for the ladder, right? Like that's really helpful. But also I actually still can't get out of the ditch. It feels like one isolated change within a much more complex, again, it's like one step around fixing a broken as opposed to dismantling a rigged, right? So the system's still rigged. I can't get out of the ditch, but thanks for the ladder. And now everyone else is like, you have a ladder, why can't you get out of the ditch? So I guess that is how I feel. I don't feel particularly hopeful about it. I'm hopeful that it will lead folks to maybe open the box on more challenging and difficult conversations, but maybe that's too ambitious. But early data from other institutions doesn't show a lot of promise when you do this in isolation. And I feel like that, at least in Michigan, which is what I know well, is what most institutions did, is go test optional for admissions purposes in real isolation of any other sort of more large strategy or change to their structure and system.
Yeah, I appreciate that anecdote. It gave me a really, it was a powerful visual. Chantel, I know you talk to a lot of different higher education institutions, and you've learned a little bit about how they're adapting to or adjusting to these new test optional policies. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And also, will these have positive or negative implications for our students?
Yeah, sure. I would say that similar to Jamie's point, many institutions are trying to figure out test optional, specifically the ones who have never considered or done this, right? And so they have, similar to transitioning to virtual learning, everyone had to kind of learn on the fly. Institutions are currently learning on the fly how to create a structure for test optional or test blind policies. And so you can imagine they are not going to get it right year one, and they are not going to get it right year two, right? It's going to take a while for them to completely think differently, because when you bring in a test optional policy, you have to think about so many factors that I don't think people are really conscious of, right? You have to think about how are you recruiting, which high schools, what types of tests, depending on the state, right? Because that score and that test is linked to so many other things except admissions into college. And so to figure out the answer of if it's going to increase the gap or decrease it, we have to also think about the other policies in place, right? Are we going to continue to have the score be the barrier around dual enrollment in AP courses? Are we going to continue to have the score set the tone around specific scholarships and state aid, right? Because all of that will have to transform, to be honest, for this to really somewhat work or get into the ditch, as Jamie would say, because even if like getting into a particular college is just one piece of this entire ball game when it comes to scores. The score is also connected to so many other things. So to your point, Yoon, institutions have to factor all of that stuff in, and it's going to take them rounds of applicant cycles to figure this out. They're probably going to talk to their colleagues who are private liberal arts, but those are so different, right? Your Oberlins and LSUs are polar opposite, right? So how do you figure out what is going to work for each of those? And then you have to factor in your border regions. Do they want test optional? Is that something that they're going to approve? What does that mean? And so again, my response has been time will tell, but we have to think about some of these other policies where the score plays an important part in that. And so are states going to tweak and make some of those changes instead of just the test optional piece?
Yeah. So many overlapping and interlocking systems. There is no capital S1 system. And I think understanding all of the specificities of the policies and the lowercase systems with an S is really important. And Anne, I know, your purview is both sort of national and local at the same time. And I would love for you to share kind of how you are understanding test optional policies or policies in higher education and some of the sort of shifting ground beneath our feet.
Yeah. And I think it's really important. Both Jamie and Chantal gave great answers about, we don't want to be dogmatic, right? Like we want to follow good, solid data that helps us understand what is actually happening for young people, right? Like dogma, if your dogma is distancing you from honest assessment, you're probably in the wrong place on this. But I think one of the things to know is that the SAT is an incredibly sophisticated instrument. It is designed by psychometricians, but not by like guys in suits in a black box, right? Like there's teachers, there's subject matter experts, there's like such a sophisticated process about how that test is created and reviewed and updated in an ongoing way. That's important to note. This is not a random, unsophisticated instrument. I think the second piece is that, like we know in education, like the shiny object, one thing solution never works. And so I think my panelists have said this well, this didn't solve for it, right? And the third thing I would flag is that admissions directors are still making judgments about young people and their abilities. And they're doing that through a range of other ways, whether it's GPA, which I agree with Chantal, there's some interesting research around the predictive power of GPA. There's also research that's compelling around teacher and educator bias. So we can't assume that the experience children are having in their elementary into middle school, high school days is sort of like a utopian free of bias environment that's moving them. That's real, it's been researched, we know that. We also know there's like this frenetic world of extras that is driving students when they apply, extracurriculars, AP, all the things that you can sort of gild their, whatever their lily is, right, to make them seem like the very best possible candidate. That is frenetic right now. When you take test out of that, you're amplifying, I think, that freneticism. And so I wonder about the candidate the applicant who might be a student of color, who is living in poverty or close to it, who works to support their family, and so is not going to come with this package of extras, but could crush that test in a way that would show their capacity and potential and in ways that is getting lost in this. So there's lots of nuance to all this around kids, and I don't think anyone, the chair of the college board to a teacher, would say there is one measure, it is the SAT or the ACT that should tell us what's going to be next for kids. But it's important to put all this into context when you think about how can kids demonstrate their potential, and have we foreclosed some kids by taking this off the table? And I think that's a big question, what that looks like.
Absolutely. And I think, what we're learning from higher education institutions is that in a test optional world, what that means is that the the test score is one data point out of many. It's not the only, just like the GPA is not the only, or the essay is not the only thing, but it's a data point, and more data is always better than less data, especially when you're making decisions, and decisions that are made by humans, which are inherently subjective. So I want to go back to something important that you said, Chantel, and I'm going to start with you, Jamie, to expound upon this. The way in which the SAT score or your ACT score is used for things outside of college admissions. I think that's important because most people automatically associate this test score as sort of, it allows you to be in or out of college. Jamie, can you talk a little bit about, say, in a place like Michigan, how does this test or test score live and breathe in the world of education there?
Yeah, I would say we do touch it mostly at MCAN on the college admissions side, but it does, because we are a test all state. So juniors, every junior in the state of Michigan, I say every, it is almost every student must sit for the SAT, even if they're sitting for, we are now an SAT state, even if you're sitting with different types of accommodations, right? You need to sit for the assessment. And that is for multiple reasons. It's one, to create equal opportunity to access the assessment for college going purposes, right? That was one major objective in moving on that policy change. The second is accountability, and in theory, accountability that isn't just punitive. I would say that is how it is internalized. That is how it feels. That is largely how it plays out in reality. I mean, that is accurate. That is true. We give schools failing grades. We say shame on you. We don't disaggregate data very well. And so the headline is the white affluent schools did well, and the students serving a high proportion of students from low income backgrounds or BIPOC students, shame on you. But their scores actually look better than the affluent districts, BIPOC students or students from low income backgrounds, but we don't really talk about that. So it does feel really punitive, but there's also, and I would say we've gotten incredibly close with the College Board as an SAT state in the last 4 years or so in Michigan. And are they a perfect organization? Of course not. Is MCAN a perfect organization? Of course not. But I do think that they have really invested in how do we make sure that this is a larger tool to teachers, to administrators, to students, to parents, to understand where their students are at, the supports their student might need, where they're excelling, where they show AP potential, and they should be pushing and challenging and saying, you've never told me I should be in an AP course, but this thing said I should be, or where they're lacking in some particular skills and where the school should be thinking about supporting them, and where the teacher should be looking at data to say, I need to change my pedagogy. I need to change, my lesson plans around X, Y, and Z. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think that we've really opened all of the opportunity there, but I do think we're trying to, and we're starting to, and I think there's some districts that have really done that. And they have seen incredible results, not just on moving an SAT score, right? Sure. They're moving their SAT score average, but they're also seeing all of these other positive benefits in their schools and in their districts. And quite frankly, they're attracting students into their district as a result. And we're a school of choice state, and we're also largely funded per pupil. So student movement is dollars, and that matters too. So, I think that's how we see it playing out at the moment in Michigan. And I just want to sort of say loud and clear, College Board has been an incredible ally in all of that work, at least in Michigan.
Great. And I think Ann and Chantel, both of you have experience in Texas and understand sort of how the test or just assessments more broadly can contribute to, as Jamie was saying, more information to guide pedagogy or open up other opportunity. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add a few. That for Texas in general, with House Bill 3, that I'm sure many of the folks in the room are familiar with, the score is one of those components, right? How can you increase to deem if a student is college ready? And so back to the accountability piece, the score also opened the door around making sure that students are held accountable. And then when you have state exams like TSI, Texas Success Initiative, a lot of students are able to kind of waive that exam if they have a certain score on the test as well. And then we see, you know, other states like Tennessee and Florida who opted to not go test optional, to really still put the test at the forefront. And so it varies across states, whether you're ACT or SAT, but there are still some of those state accountability metrics that districts are using, that states are using, and the ACT or SAT score are still playing a big factor into that, as well as I mentioned before, when it comes to state funding for students for tuition exemptions, promise programs, and things like that. Those are also situations where the score is also relevant. So I've been sharing with families in general around should I still have my kid, you know, study for this? Should they still be concerned about this? And my response is absolutely. Absolutely continue to study, continue to try to get the prep if you can, continue to submit those scores, because all the rest of the policies haven't changed yet. And so however we feel about the exam, it is still a crucial component of a student's trajectory. And so at this moment, I think we should be still considering and still making sure, especially students of color, underrepresented students who were out for the pandemic, who won't be able to showcase those extracurriculars, who we haven't really shifted to show work experience as a real extracurricular, right? We haven't shifted to that. And so I've been specifically in my community sharing to families and teachers and test prep instructors that it still matters. And maybe in a world it won't, but now, and at least for the next couple of years, it still does matter, probably even more. And so we have to be honest about that and continue to, in my opinion, continue to push those conversations to our schools and communities.
Yep.
I absolutely agree. Chantel is so smart about this. I think I'll put it this way, white privileged kids are taking the test, right? And let's just be totally honest about that piece of it and what it means and what it unlocks and accesses for you. And the other thing I want to say that's interesting in California, because, and there might've been a question about this in the Q&A, the UC system is not test optional. It is like no test now with the latest bit of the judge's ruling, which means if an optional, you could go back and look at the test if you want like a double check for a student, which they say was privileging white students over in that sort of go back and check, which comes with an optional test. But I've also heard stories about kids who I was reading a story from a mom earlier whose student did well on the test, worked hard, like built a whole package based on the UC admissions, did really well on the test, was upset that was going to be going away, and that they're talking about, well, you could write about it in your essay. Like there are ways to share your SAT score. Let's be clear. Like I don't have to send you the scores, but then choose to write in my essay potentially about what I did. This was an immigrant family talking about like what her pathway and why this was an important piece of it. So I think we have to be eyes wide open about sort of what's really happening and then not have that sort of lack of access or understanding sometimes how the system works for students who may not come from college going families who are learning this for the first time and leading themselves through the process, to make sure that they're not disadvantaged by hearing about, oh, it's optional, it doesn't really mean anything. I can take this off my list of things to do when that's not the place we're at.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I think all three of you raised some really interesting questions about accountability, about how sometimes accountability might feel punitive, and specifically in sort of this time of the pandemic when, you know, students, and this is one of the questions in the doc, you know, when students are under stressors like a pandemic or natural disasters or aren't able to take that test, you know, how do these tests and these accountability systems not compound the stressors? How do we think about that? And I know this is a broader conversation about assessments and accountability in general, not just the SAT in particular, but what are your thoughts on that? Do you see any better alternatives or options?
Yeah, I'll try to tackle that because Louisiana obviously is notorious for hurricanes, and it has been a hurricane season. It's been just awful, and so you can imagine just the past year. I mean, let's be honest. If we've had the pandemic, some have had hurricanes, racial situations, political climate. Like it has been a lot, and you can imagine if you're a senior or a junior trying to study and test for this exam with all of that going on, that is difficult. And so my recommendation and things that I've pushed as I'm working with institutions is when they're thinking about test optional policies or just policies in general or waivers or things like that, allowing students to, submit those essays. I'm again a big fan of the personal statement. I know a lot of state schools or they do still allow the personal statements. I know it's a bigger weight around private schools, but I always encourage students, especially if you've had a specific reason around maybe why your test score is lower or your GPA is lower, really being able to submit the essay or have your teachers who are writing those letters of recommendation, adding those pieces in there so that the institution is aware of what you've experienced. And you would hope, obviously, in Louisiana, if you're going to go in-state, they're aware of the things that the hurricanes and things like that. But it does play a part. It does play a part into the whole entire factor. And so there is no perfect solution, unfortunately, to it yet. But I think it's up to institutions to really figure out, how do we look at students holistically? How do we consider, what exactly is going on with them, but also still be true to the things that do matter, and are they going to be able to perform during the first year of post-secondary? So I think it's trying to strike that balance of like compassion, but also like transparency in regards to rigor.
One thing I would add to that is we're big believers in accountability and assessment. I'm sure that doesn't surprise anyone that I work at the George W. Bush Institute and would say that, but we're not robots, right? But here's what I think about assessment is an important part of learning. It has been since the ancient times, so it's not new. Assessment isn't new, and it's what makes an assessment high quality is if it's giving you comparable, valid information that has a purpose. And there are a lot of tests, whether they're classroom design, district design, that may not meet that, or in some cases, a state formative assessment where what is learned is not actually put into place in an effective way that makes sense to teachers, students, and educators. So that's a different problem. That's not a test problem. That's like, what are you doing with the information you have? On the accountability side, I always get sad when people think of that as punitive for kids, because it should be punitive for the system that is leading to the outcomes the kids are experiencing, right? We're investing an insane amount of public dollars into our public system with the goal of preparing young people for opportunity in their futures where they have agency and choice. And so we're okay with holding the system accountable, our kids actually getting what they need in order to be successful. There's lots of ways to do that. I think people are getting smarter and testing out innovative things, but we don't come from the position that accountability is bad or assessment is bad. We actually think they're like anything. It's how they're used, and keeping the end goal in mind is what's important.
Yep. I'm going to ask a question to you all. It goes back to this idea of how are things interpreted, how are things received, and so a question from one of our audience members. A hot topic of conversation currently is vaccine hesitancy and fear, much of which is grounded in historically racist medical practices. And we know similarly that there is test hesitancy and resistance. So how can educators target messaging in ways that promote testing and test prep as opportunities rather than, burdens and, sort of fear or of accountability or punitive? How do you respect those historical roots while also acknowledging the hesitancy and how things have been interpreted and passed down historically? So that's an open question for all of you.
Chantel, I want you to answer. if you're
I was
willing.
reading, I was trying to, and I'm distracted, y'all. I was reading the chat and trying to figure out if that was the same question that came to play. So it is difficult, right? So, our history doesn't lie. And there's a lot of systemic issues when it comes to these exams. There's a lot of systemic issues when it comes to the vaccine and all of the things. And so, however, as I've been communicating to folks is, regardless of how you feel about X, Y, and Z, or what we really know to be true is that the exam still unlocks X, Y, and Z. Right. And so I'm still honest with from my students to C-suites of CEOs to CEOs of nonprofits to college presidents, that it still continues to unlock money, scholarships, opportunities for students, specifically if you are a high academic student of color that's trying to get into an Ivy League or a small private liberal arts. It is still something to think about, and those students have the option of getting their tuition covered. So there are still some opportunities there, even though we know that there's a large systemic gap when it comes to these exams, and not even just ACT, SAT. I mean, we can have a whole rabbit hole around GRE, MCAT, and all the other things that I won't take us down because I have personal feelings about those too. But nevertheless, in general, at the end of the day, we haven't gotten to a place where we know enough. As I mentioned, we still have cycles of data that we're going to have to look at for the next 5 years. And kudos to California for making it the next 3 years, so at least they can start tracking what this is looking like. And I encourage other states to really think about that as well, so that we can see if it's a big factor, or if students who didn't submit those exams, that they still graduate within 6 years at a similar rate than their colleagues, right? So those are some of the research studies that are going to happen. But to your point is addressing what is real, right? Being very transparent about that, but also addressing the other piece that's real, which is this also unlocks this, and that for you. So specifically in Louisiana, the 20 will unlock at this moment in-state tuition and fees. That's reality. The test will unlock dual enrollment in AP, right? That is reality. And so it's encouraging students to understand the why behind the test. And so as I've worked with other nonprofits who do offer test prep, a lot of them, as you mentioned, test confidence, right? Talking about socio-emotional learning, not just, hey, can you do this math problem, but like understanding how the test was written. Why is it written the way it is? Address the systemic issues around the test. I wish I would have known that it was surrounded by all of that, because I was taking the test so many times and just thinking like, why can't I do well on this exam? Like, I have a 4.0 in high school, like this doesn't make any sense. But I also didn't know all of the things around the exam. And so I think being transparent to students and families about the current flaws and the great parts about the exam, but also still being honest about what it currently unlocks, specifically if you're at a state where it does unlock scholarships, state aid, and things like that, or if you're thinking about out-of-state universities as well. And so I think it's trying to balance both realities when having those conversations with educators and those that are going to be the one administering the test, because what we don't want is for teachers or educators to kind of take a stance district-wide and say, we're not going to provide test prep. It doesn't matter. We're not going to fund this, because as Ann mentioned, our white privileged colleagues are still studying and taking that exam. Harvard's apps were still up this past year. So let's not be fooled by the system. Let's really have those open conversations and really still encourage something that we know unlocks. Now, there may be a day where the score does not unlock X, Y, and Z. Then we will cross that bridge when it comes. But now it is still, it still can be somewhat of an equalizer for students, depending on, which state they live in.
Absolutely.
So hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to what I said at the very beginning. I think it's the difference between bare minimum versus competitive advantage. And there are absolutely, even in the middle of the pandemic, students whose parents were driving them across state lines. so they could take this test, right? I think that is your point about acknowledging multiple realities. Yes, the history, yes, the outcomes being so uneven, but yes, there are ways in which this test can be used to propel students. So one, I think this is the last question in terms of time, but a couple of people have in some way or another posed questions about test blind. Meaning, test optional is a world in which the test is not a requirement. You can submit it or not, but test blind is, for those who may not be aware, you can submit your score. We're not going to look at it. So can you, I'd love for us to end on a note of sort of thinking about what is an equitable system for our students. And so I would like to pose to each of you, Jamie, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on whether or not it would be more equitable if we just went test blind?
I have a lot of thoughts, but I think I still go back to is it one decision in isolation, or is it a change to the systems and the structures? Are we, and who are we going test blind or test free for? Is it institutional bottom line? Is it to admit a different class of students? Is it to use a different, what we believe to be more equitable admittance strategy? Like why are we going test blind or test free or whatever the language is that's being used? And is there again, like a larger strategy? Because like Ann said, and Chantel said, there's all sorts of research around GPA as a predictor. There's actually research around self-placement into courses. So there probably in the future could be research on self-admittance. Like, I think I can compete there and I'll show you I can. I don't know, right? But that's loaded because there's all of these other pieces attached to those things. I am going to self-admit, if you dig into the research around self-placement, students that come from more affluent backgrounds, white students, self-place themselves in higher levels, right? That is a fact as well. And so I've been sent, different messages have come my way, both very directly and passively have come my way as an affluent white student. And I believe I have different abilities than other students, and I self-place myself in different places. And so I just think we have to, I just don't think it can be a conversation about a test, right? I don't think that that's the answer. Yes, test, no test. In terms of admittance, even, and to your point, a student, an affluent student who took the test could find a way to work it into their optional essay, and that school's forced to see it, right? They now saw it. What are they going to do with that information? And there's all sorts of research around bias and review that doesn't include data points like GPA or tests that are still, yes, could still have flaws, but so does my personal biases that I may hold as I'm assessing a more holistic review of a student. So I don't know what the answer is. I think a lot of people have to get in the same room with some really positive intentions, and I think that's challenging to think about. But I don't think it's the test. I don't think it's a conversation about, is the absence or presence of the test the answer, right? I just don't think it actually is that powerful one way or the other.
Yeah. And how about you?
I'm not bullish on a test blind world. I don't think we're there. I think there, and that's not to say I don't think there's issues that, or have been historically issues with the test. Those are, I want to make sure that's clear. Those are different statements, but I'm a big believer in valid, reliable, comparable measures. And for better or for worse, the SAT and ACT have given us that as one component of an admissions picture that I think is useful and beneficial for lots of reasons. And I think I was so glad when Chantal was talking in the last question about this idea of transparency. The more transparent we are about that, the better off kids are and their parents. With transparency around it. There's hundreds of thousands of applicants to the UC system. they are making judgments. They're making judgments. We have less transparency into how they're making those judgments at this point.
Yep. Yep. Chantel, last word goes to you.
This is tough because my hat is saying we need to study the next 5 years, right? We need to learn from California. We need to see where the data lies, and it is so complex. It is so complex, and I mean, I can go again down another rabbit hole around elementary education and starting from the beginning and how that is trajected all the way through to an ACT score, where your community, your zip code, your income, your upbringing. And so there's so many complexities. But my biggest piece is, if we were to go or look into, I think it's worth exploring test-free. It is worth exploring if you're going to do all of it test-free. So test-free dual enrollment, test-free AP, test-free state aid, test-free accountability, right? Like dismantling it and really looking at those cohort of students to see what the performance is, what the assessment is, and all of that. Because again, because it is tied to so much, not just college admissions, it's hard to study it by itself, right? And so again, if I was doing some sort of project on my own state, that would be a recommendation of like, let's test free it all and see what happens. It could blow up and be like, this was not a good idea, right? But it could show us that like, those kids actually graduated in 6 years.
Yeah.
Let's see that, you know, what we need to change. And so again, I think it's just up to us as researchers and educators to continue to study this, to see how this post-pandemic shift has either done this or done that. So I'm back to time will tell around test optional and test free for sure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Chantel and Jamie, so much for a great discussion. I learned a ton from you, as I knew I would. I hope our audience members did as well. So thank you so much for sharing. On a sort of final note, for our audience, if you're interested in continuing the conversation or learning more about CollegeSpring, please feel free to visit our website or reach out directly to me or our head of partnerships, Colleen Pepsicki. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending today. We appreciate you all. Have a great day.